trash talker. I'm a trash talker. I'm sorry. I was channeling my inner Tom Jones.
Trash and talk as we go by.
Have you seen anything from Tom Jones over the last, I don't know, couple, 3 years? Like
No,
on
but I will.
YouTube?
I will now that you mentioned it while we're connected to the
Yeah,
internet.
this is true. The dude is, he's in his 80s if he's a day. All right. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, but that son of a gun can still belt. That man still has a voice and he sounds like he's 19 when he sings. I mean, it just mind blowing. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't even know where that came from.
But I'm a girl watcher. Watching
Mhm.
girls go by. My was it? It wasn't Tom Jones, but it sounds kind of like that.
I thought it was
It is
Tom
that
Jones.
era, I would assume. But
Now you got me wondering. I thought it was. No, it wasn't. The Ocasins in 1960s. Okay. I thought Tom Jones did that.
no, Tom Jones did Pussycat, Pussycat, you're
Yeah,
so
he did that too.
bad.
He did that too. Okay. But maybe I don't know music as much as I thought I did. That's all right.
I wonder how many. I wonder how many guys
Mm.
back in the day were rushed to in line at the record store, waiting for that hot pressed Pussycat album. I wonder how many guys were just lined along and say, "Dude, have you heard that new Pussycat song?" And another dude with long hair and saying, "Yeah, dude, it's like freaking psychedelic."
A ton of guys. Do you know why? Because the girls liked him.
Yeah, but can you? But I guess you can say that, but you
Yeah,
know, but you can say that about anything. But you know what I'm saying?
I do
There's
know
no
what you're
guy.
saying.
There's no guy. Well, I can't say there's no guy, but I know what you're saying. I get the point.
Mhm.
It's the anything
Yeah,
for the
I
chick.
was going to say guys don't buy the Partridge Family albums because they like them. They buy them because the girls like them.
Yeah, but guess what? I never saw Partridge Family records in any guy's collect. Maybe they hide it when their friends come over.
Mhm. Yeah, you have that special cubby hole where you put all this stuff that you save for the women.
Earl, don't open that drawer. What do you got in there? Partridge Family A tracks. You
Mhm.
I don't know that that's I don't I did in the past buy, but I actually genuinely like so I had a high school sweetheart
Mhm.
um and she was well I'm not going to get too specific as who knows where the but let's just say and she was interested she liked the Cuban music
Mhm.
and I would have to listen to it cuz that's what I was around.
Mhm.
And you'd assume because my family being Cuban that I'd be entrenched in said music
Mhm.
and all this and that. But that's not the case because of the generational. It's complicated, but it's not. You grow up in the environment you do, listening to the rock and roll because it's what you and your buddies
Mhm.
and and your parents' stuff is your parents' stuff. Um, but she was actually from Cuba,
Mhm.
and so she brought that
Yeah.
those traditions over that over and so I got exposed to it from her in that way, and so I delved into it, so I did acquire some, um and I found the value in it and interest in it on a musical level,
Right.
but I couldn't be bothered to enjoy something maybe enjoy or force enjoy myself to
Right.
something that I don't like. So I would probably be on the other end of the scale of saying, you know what, I'm not
Okay.
gonna entertain such a
Let me kind of qualify that statement, okay? Because you're talking about high school. High school was different. You're a little bit more mature and you tend to hang around with people that are interested in things that you're interested in. So probably by the time you got to high school, the girls you tended to be around were into the rock and roll as well. That one girl being an exception, obviously. That's an outlier. But you're probably not going to go for the girls who are into things that you're just not into. You know,
No.
I was kind of that way myself anyway. When luckily when I was in high school, the big names were like Fleetwood Mac and Boston and Leonard Skinner and things like that. So it was easy for me to have the albums that the girls already liked because I liked that music. But I'm talking about when I was much younger and just starting out in my musical journey. Yeah, I used to kind of poo poo the Partridge Family and Donny Osmond and all that other kind of stuff. I never bought any of their records. My mother had an my mother hasn't had an Osmond Family album. So that immediately was a red X on my part, just no, that's mom's music. Staying away from that entirely. But as I matured a little bit, my musical taste matured a lot. I was lucky enough to run with a crowd that liked the same kind of music. And that included the girls that kind of gravitated toward that crowd. So,
There's more. I can't say this, but I'm assuming it, and you could correct me if that's true, if it's kind of true or not true or somewhat true or whatever the case. But just on a place of origins level,
mhm,
this might not be true, but I think it is. Miami is more encompassing in terms of variation of people coming from different places and bringing
mhm.
whatever music and traditions and whatnot. So I was exposed. So what I'm getting at is that like you'd walk around school and you'd have different pockets of, and you'd have that anyways. But what I'm saying is there's just very distinct different pockets of interest in terms of music or whatever,
Yeah,
due to just where all people were coming from at one point or the other.
yeah,
And so you had this situation where you'd get your little cliques, um, but and the rock and roll was part of that,
mhm,
and guys usually, but not all, because some of them
mhm.
went into the pop, and which
Right.
I consider the I may be wrong. I consider the guys, and I'm talking about back in the day.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, I don't think the same way now, but analyzing the guys that went for that pop music, that totally devoid of soul and spirit music. Um, in my opinion, they did so for that reason that you're saying, because this is what the chicks like. So they hopped on that train. Whereas the rock and roll, and I'm talking about my era growing up and whatnot, was, yes, it was full of babes, digging it, but it had this rebellious, anti-social aspect to it, like rock and roll always had this rebellious
Mhm.
nature. And the mainstream of our kids were actually going with the pop flow, and roughly the outcast nudged towards the rock and roll. That's how I saw it back in the day, and I think that the pop stuff, yes, those guys that were totally on board with that pop stuff were kind of doing it, or they could have been doing it because they just don't dig the rock and roll, and they just like
Right.
the shallow, empty void, devoid of all spirit, depth, music.
Well, there was that divide, but it was a little bit bigger because it was one of those cases of, you know, my display name here, right place, wrong time. This was one of those cases of right place, right time, because you had that divide between the pop folks and the rock and roll folks. But this was about the time that AM radio and FM radio always had that divide as well, but FM was really starting to come into its own. And FM was more freeform. Number one, it was in stereo, so it sounded better, but it was more freeform. AM stuck to that 3-minute dopamine hit Let's get 3 songs commercial, 3 songs commercial, 3 songs commercial. And growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, there were about 8 stations to choose from. So you could push a button, a song come on you didn't like, you could hit a button and go to the next station. Something nothing there, hit a button, go to the next station. I think my dad spent more times pushing the channel buttons on the radio than he did actually listening to a song. And that was just because he didn't like most of what he heard. And when he landed on something, we'd hear like the last half of Creedence Clearwater tune, and then they'd put on the Temptations, and he was hunting again. You know, so you had the AM radio. We called them the plastic banana AM rockers. It was 100% pop all the time. It could be, oh my gosh, it could be anybody being played, but it was always that AM short format. I was the FM guy, and that's the crowd that I ran with, and they called us the maggot infested dope smokers. I didn't smoke dope, but I didn't want to hear a edited 3-minute version of a song. I wanted to listen to KSJO out of San Jose, where the DJ would drop the needle on side 1 of Steve Miller Band's Book of Dreams and let the entire side play, then do a few commercials, and then flip it over and do side 2. It was long format, free form, and if he was in the mood to play 2 Led Zeppelin songs back to back, he did it. He wasn't he wasn't forced into this top 40 format. And that created a huge divide in the music that you heard around campus or in the neighborhoods or what have you. I never once heard Freebird on AM radio, but I heard it a lot on FM. I can only think of 2 Pink Floyd songs I ever heard on AM radio, and that one was Money and the other was Us and Them. But you'd hear all of Dark Side of the Moon on FM. It just depended on what the DJ was into. It was really free form like that. And I was lucky enough that about 4 people in my neighborhood were into that, and I just got to hang out with them. So it was a great time to grow up, musically speaking. But I wasn't part of that plastic banana pop stuff. I just didn't care about Sean Cassidy or the Bay City Rollers. I didn't want to hear that crap.
Well, so you know, I guess I'll speak from my side. So I wouldn't have known it at the time because I wasn't thinking in those terms. But looking at it back now, um, when I was being exposed to music just through whatever the main things were, radio and whatnot, this and that. We likewise had various channels, plus oldies, plus all
Yeah.
the variety that one has back then. And but when I was growing up, and I've mentioned it before, we had the back catalog within the realm of like rock music. So we had the 50s, 60s, and
Mhm.
70s to draw from, and they were intermixed with it on radio along with whatever was coming out. But we had this strong push with the hair metal
Mhm.
music, and even though punk wasn't played much on radio, at least not down here that I remember, it was mainly the polished, because it was really incredibly. By the time we came up or started coming up, rock and roll and the producers, engineers, musicians drew from so many sources, and engineering had increased so much
Mhm.
that the product that was being put out on the radio was, mind you, regardless of whether one likes the genre in specific or not, just
Mhm.
the technicality of how they equalized and how they presented songs was so polished that
Yeah.
I think it was the epitome of epitome. I mean, even in the pop world, which they weren't pop originally, but people from the '60s, such as Phil Collins, let's say, that was doing more pop stuff on the radio back then. Um, the quality was just
Yeah.
forget about it. It was like out of
Yeah.
astronomical. Well, just to wrap up this idea, because it reminded me of something when you were explaining. In the '80s, we had that, and so we had a sheer decade of that kind of stuff, which was full of excess.
Hmm.
Um, girls in bikinis and Daisy Dukes, as musicians played. I just everything was blown to the
Hmm.
extreme of like, and that's what we were listening to, or the darker heavy metal, whatever.
Yeah.
But when the '90s rolled around, the beginning of the '90s, um, I remember driving. I'll just mention this one event. There were two events, but I'll just mention this. I remember driving, and I remember where I was driving. I can actually remember the first time I heard this. I was driving on Bird on Coral Way, parked at the light, and whoever lives in this area would know. Parked at the light at the crossroads of 107th and Bird Road, and I turned left, going back to my house. I think going back to my house. I don't remember that part, but I remember that as I turned, I mean, notice how powerful this is.
Hmm.
Our memories. As I turned, I'm talking about like 23, 25, 30 years ago. As I turned down or up, down or up 107th heading towards Sweetwater, the DJ said, and here's a new one by Pearl Jam. And they played a Pearl Jam song. Now, here's the reason it's so significant to me. And it panned out to be. This was the grunge people.
Hmm.
The music that I heard coming out of the speakers, not quite, but did remind me of the '60s in terms of spirit, where it's no longer talking about excesses in terms of, chicks and a Saturday night and
Cars and motorcycles and all that. Yeah.
right, like the heavy metal that we were listening to, and it wasn't quite the thrash metal of Metallica and all these people. It was someplace as if the '60s were brought into our era, because the lyrical content was different. And I was like, this, I can't believe they're playing this on the radio. I'm mind blown. I was mind blown. And
Hmm.
I drove home and I eventually got that album. But grunge was the replacement of the excessive '80s. Yeah. And it turns out that, in my opinion, looking at it now, if I had my preference, I'd be listening to the '80s hair
Well,
metal
I,
as
I
opposed to grunge.
I want to say it was Purdue University, but I may be wrong on that. So don't hold me to it being Purdue. But there was a study done about the psychological connection with music, and every generation has a connection with the generation that they grew up in. From about the time you're 13 years old till you're about 18, everybody has an emotional connection with that time period, the music you listen to during that time period. But over all demographics, over all age groups, the different races, social classes, regions, everything else, there is a huge bump upwards. They all agree that the music from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, from about 76 to about 85, was the best era for music, for American music, because across all demographics, there was a huge emotional attachment to that era of music, along with whatever generation they grew up, whatever decade
Are
they
you trying to tell me that people after the fact and or people prior to the fact all agree?
yes. There is a bump up. They were mostly emotionally connected with the music that they were brought up with during that time of their life, from age
Okay.
13 to about 18.
Okay.
But they were also very emotionally connected with the music from about 1976 to about 1985. It's mutually agreed that that was probably the best span of music in America.
Yeah, the 80s. So I'm living my the story of my, call it, life book, life,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah,
So that's going to figure very strongly in my uh, opinions and likes and dislikes and all this and that. And it takes a little bit of effort if we're lucky, and I believe if we're lucky, to try and step outside of oneself and look at the situation as if you were someone else, not yourself, in order to gain a
mhm,
different type of perspective, vantage point. And the usefulness of that is, is to sort of check the landscape and picture things,
sure.
beyond
Step
the,
outside yourself, more or less.
yeah, to so that way you're kind of checking. I guess it's a way of of seeing possibilities. Maybe you're seeing something slightly off and this and that. And I understand the potential of me seeing a lot of things off due to me being born in that era. Um, but and one of the influences is the fact that I was growing up in that era
Hmm.
and establishing friendships and experiencing things for the first time. And but if I had, and people would say the different thing, but I think that the 80s, and you can nudge it back and nudge it forward with it, but the 80s is probably, this is going to be maybe not agreeable to most people, that don't, obviously, but I think it was the, in hindsight, the epitome, up until till then and after, of American, just all good things converging. Um, and again, I could be fooled, but of all good things converging, in terms of everything, dude, everything, and music being played at that time is attached to it. But again, you're saying it's not my bias. You're saying that anywhere from
Well,
75 to,
yeah, because I mean, you take an album like Boston's debut release, you play somebody who is 14 years old, you play More Than a Feeling. They can connect with that tune. They can connect with that song. I mean, it has aged very well. It could have been released last year, but it was released in 77.
it couldn't have been released last year because if you judge by, well, yes, it
But
could have, but if you judge,
but you get what I'm saying. It's easy for young people to make that emotional connection with that tune because it's relatable still today. Yeah.
okay, on, interestingly, this is an interesting, not even an aside. It's part of the conversation that we're having now.
Hmm.
Um, I am a little bit like you in terms of, I mean, sometimes you'll say things that I can see that, oh yeah, well, I think that way too, but I don't always think that way. I'll think in my mind, or yes, there's a moment that I do think that way, and so, but you've mentioned it often where you, and obviously you're just saying that as a end cap. It doesn't mean that it's flat out, although it could be. You
Yeah.
tell me. You, damn, I just heard a car. You know when the tire flattens? I
Hmm.
heard down the highway, some dude is still running it, and it's flat, and he's gonna have trouble because he's not stopping for nobody. I just heard it go. Um, a lot of people do that, dude. So you have said on various occasions where it's like, dude, I'm a cultural infidel.
Hmm.
And then you'll mention things like certain movies and whatnot. You said the last movie I saw was
Rain
um,
Man.
Rain Man. Well, obviously that's not true. True, you've seen other movies, but from that
Well, I've
era,
seen other movies, but not in a theater. That's
in
so,
the theater, in the theater.
yes.
Um, so, and but there's this notion that's attached to that when you say that,
Hmm.
of, you don't easily bring into your entertainment fold I mean, it's not like we don't know this already because we've talked
Mhm.
about it, but it's not like you easily accept every new little gimmick that's tossed in front
No,
of
I
people to
don't.
grab onto.
No, I don't.
Right. Um, and so I'm kind of slightly like that,
Mhm.
but
Well,
I will give movies a chance because there's
mhm.
always that hope, and many times you get disappointed. But
You
let
know,
me. Well,
it's
go ahead. Go
weird.
ahead.
It's weird because you're more open to movies. You just said you'll give movies a chance.
Hmm.
I'm less likely to do it with movies. I'm more likely to do it with music because I do like music. And but I know what I like and what sounds good to me. I don't care who did it. If it sounds good and I can get into it, I really don't care who did it. I'll listen to it. I might go buy it. Movies, I don't know. I guess there's more time invested in it. And I feel like I'm more or less trapped because you started off and you're like, okay, this better pick up, and then something decent will happen, and okay, and then by the time you decide, or at least me, by the time I decide I don't like it, I've already spent an hour into it, and it's like, I really don't care about the story. Let's just see how this ends, you know.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the reason I started down this line
Hmm.
is because, in terms of not accepting new stuff and this and that, I was hesitant when I heard rumblings about this new song, uh, and it's all the rage. And in fact, it is all the rage, not even by a little. It's got like in the tens of millions of views, like upwards of 60, and that's just on one site. That's not even the person's site. And the song is called Richmond North uh, of
Of
Richmond.
Richmond, yeah.
And so I hesitated to even listen to it
Same here.
for the same reason. I don't want to jump on any bandwagon and stuff, and then I'm stuck with this thing. It's a silly thing, but I think it's also something from our era where we grab onto certain clicks. Like I wouldn't be dead listening to Poison, because guys wouldn't listen to Poison because it's too sassy for. And yet Poison is I had Poison albums. I just
But
kept
you would
like
never wear the t-shirt.
I would never wear the T-shirt.
Well, and this is where my biases come in because I'm not a country music fan. There are a few country uh, artists, country singers that I will listen to. I think Toby Keith is fun. And so some of his more humorous songs, I'll listen to
I
them.
like his. I have an album of his. I bought one
I,
back in the day.
I don't have any of his albums, but I have listened to a few of his songs and I won't turn them off. I won't go hunting for another channel if they come on. But make a special I don't make a special trip to go get any of his music. I don't go out of my way to find it. And my bias on that was I saw the thumbnail for it, and here's this guy with crew cut, we used to call it, just basically the longest hair on his head was about an eighth of an inch tall, and a bright red beard, standing there with a resonator guitar, that dobro he's got. And immediately my brain said, not my style of music, and I didn't click. The other part of my bias is I've been burned too many times by this. The more people rant and rave about how great it is, the more I know I'm going to hate it. It's just that way. That's why I've never seen Forrest Gump. That's why I've never seen Titanic. The more people rant and rave about it, from the critics down to people on the street, the more I know I'm not going to like it. And it's been that way too many times.
Well, if you think of well, I don't want to diverge, but I'm gonna have to. If you
But I
think of
did
some,
listen to that song. I did listen to that song, just
well,
so
we'll
you
get back to that. But according to what you just
know.
said,
Okay.
because I have something to say about, but just according to what you just said now, in terms of movies and popularity, um, it's a difficult one because if you take someone like Quentin Tarantino,
Hmm.
he's all the rage. And so you'd probably be like, well, he's all the rage, and all these people, you know how they say 5 million Elvis fans or whatever can't be wrong and this and that. Um, well, um, yes, they can. Well, but here's the thing. But here's the thing, though. At the level of explicit violence
Hmm.
for sheer gratification,
Hmm.
a segment of the population gravitates towards that,
Right.
and so they're attached to his stuff. Others are attached to his overuse of bad words
Hmm.
in his dialogue, um, and that rebellious thing. So people gravitate towards things for different reasons.
Hmm.
But underlying all that, in the case of Tarantino, um, he's a damn good script writer. The dialogue, the videography, there's depth there that even and some things can't be denied. So sometimes it is sometimes the popularity properly matches the product.
Hmm.
And in terms of going back, let's this is how I'll tie this to Richmond, North of Richmond, um, which is a great title on its own,
Hmm.
because it bounces back and forth, for obvious reasons. If you think of this guy that came out with this song and he's got like 60 million views and who knows even
60,
more,
64 million last time I saw. Yeah.
I mean that's just insanity.
Hmm.
All the rockers put together, maybe not all put together, but a lot of them put together, would wish
Yeah.
that they had this guy. And I'm talking about rockers of
Hmm.
caliber from back in the day.
Oh yeah.
Uh, that at this point in time, the majority of people don't even know who, Billy Joel, you
Yeah.
know, stuff like that. Well, this guy honestly expressed in his lyrics concerns that a certain number of Americans and even people around the world are like uh,
Hmm.
a certain sense he tuned into from a very backdoors, grab your guitar, and
Hmm.
let your heart say it as you feel it type of thing. And in the lyrics, he's expressing emotions based on basic,
Frustrating.
basic current events, but they're open ended the way he phrases it.
Hmm.
But it means specific things to the people listening to it due to the climate that exists in the country today, and so on and so forth. So he's speaking things, and it kind of harkens back to a Bob Dylan. It's not the same style, but
No, it's not.
it's the same um, key being turned where people, yes, Bob Dylan was a little bit. I'm not making that as a direct thing. I'm making that
Right.
as the connection between him and Bob Dylan is not the actual specifics of the thing, but that people were touched by things in a political and cultural way.
And an emotional way, because just listen to the way he sings it. You There's no sensing about it. You see and feel his frustration, and that's what that tune says to me. It's 100% frustration,
Yeah.
you know and people can identify with that. Now, maybe you have never been into any of the situations that he talks about in his lyrics, but you can identify with that level of frustration,
Well, the
where
key is
you
that he
where
leaves
you
it open,
think that you're alone and nobody gives a damn.
yeah, he leaves it open ended so that it
Hmm.
applies
Hmm.
to whatever you're sitting through.
Hmm.
You can say, well, heck, that kind of nails it for me in terms of what I'm feeling and stuff.
Yeah.
So he leaves it slightly open. It's not like he's being explicit
Yeah.
in the oh, because this politician and that, and therefore he's just giving impressions, which is what music does.
Yeah.
and then it runs wild in the imaginations of the listeners, and then it becomes. But it would not have been. I mean, who am I to say either way? But it would have not taken off the way it did if not for the fact that he is reflecting broadly very specific things that people are feeling in the world today.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so
because he also lives it. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen any interviews with the guy, if you know anything about him or what have you. He
I
in
saw
the
a little bit.
song, he kind of looks like this backwoods country bumpkin. In some ways, he is. In other ways, he's not. He's just a guy. He's a working guy. He lives. He bought some property, and he got a $90,000 mortgage. He still owes 60,000 on it, and
Not anymore.
he yes, still he lives in a camp trailer he bought off of Craigslist for $750 on this property, covered by a tarp. He turned down an $8 million deal. He said, that ain't me. I'm not. He says, I can sing fair. I'm mediocre on the guitar. That's not me. That's not who I am. I don't want to do that. I just want to work, and I want what's mine to be mine. I want to earn what I've got, and that's it.
Well, a couple of things too. It seems there's always, as best as it can happen, a representative
Mm-hmm.
of the sentiment of the people,
Sure.
the public at large, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and unfortunately, or fortunately, well, it's kind of like a hymn, or kind of like, yeah, a hymn. Let's say it's something that allows people to coalesce along an idea that is irking them
Mm-hmm.
uh, in one way or the other. And
Exactly.
so, but it's unfortunate. That's not unfortunate, but I feel like I'm looking at the unfortunate that if not so the laser beam to focus that frustration, um, they're putting on this gentleman that's singing these songs, and fair enough, that's good. But all these people in mass have the potential of, if laser focusing their attention on a congressperson, on a specific issue, on a specific, have the ability and power by sheer numbers to affect, whatever it is that irks. But unfortunately, at the same time, um, we're like a ship on the ocean, and the waves pushing us back and forth, and we're all little ships on the ocean and
Sure.
stuff. And this coalescing of grouping of people, although affect, it's a
Well,
it's a very complex thing. But this singer guy did laser focus a sentiment that people
yeah.
are obviously feeling,
Well,
because it's so many views.
because I would venture to say the majority of people agree with the sentiment of that song. They're frustrated too. They're frustrated as well. I mean, well, Steve just threw in here. He just canceled the concert because he found out the promoters were charging $100 a ticket. You know, I can kind of I can kind of get behind that, because that's not who he is. That's not what he's about. I
Yeah,
mean,
but I don't know if I can get behind. I mean, I can get behind that's a decision, but I can't
mhm.
get behind that in terms of me thinking, if, and this is the stuff of serious stuff, um, at least nowadays, because before it wouldn't be one way or the other. But we're in such a strange place. Um, if he has the ability to be so popular, which he does, follow
Mhm.
me with this
Okay.
thought, and you
Okay.
tell me if this is proper or not.
Okay.
I'm sure there's variations, but is what I'm saying
Mhm.
somewhat reasonable or whatever? Um, he has the ability to gather people in concert halls
Mhm.
and share a message which not only shares the experience of hanging out at a concert one evening, but also providing a reinforcement of this sentiment,
Mm-hmm.
which could propagate. So what I'm getting at is that it's not only beneficial. So even though it's not him
Mm-hmm.
to charge $100, um, which is fine, but him doing that um, does help create this
And
solidification of this. It can help propagate this sentiment of like, oh, you naughty people, that run,
right.
thing. I get that it's not him, but I'm saying that.
Well, I can kind of see where he's coming from because you are coming at this as the blue collar working guy carrying a lunch bucket. You got two dogs and you live on your 5 acres. Can I, with a clear conscience, charge $100 a ticket for that? No, I can't. Why don't we do this out in the park where, I don't know, if you have to charge a gate, no more than $20. You know, if you can get away with it, let's do 10 or 15. Let's let the folks who identify with that song have a chance at coming to see it. I can get behind that. I can see that. You know,
Yeah,
it's real hard. It, I have a philosophical issue with pulling in 6 or 7 figures running around the country telling people how hard it is to make a living. To me, that's just the hypocrisy of that entire thing is craziness to
I
me.
I I get it, but I at the same time I don't. And the
Well,
reason why is that, well, no, but let me explain. Well, go
okay.
ahead,
I
and
was
I'll
going to say
explain.
you can bet he's making money, but I mean, he didn't even post that video on his own YouTube channel. That video isn't on his channel; it's on another channel.
But what's the point? Is what I'm getting at. So,
Well,
well, let me expand on it so you understand
okay,
what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is a very specific thing.
okay,
If this is an anthem to the working man being done wrong, and you have 60 million people flocking to see the video, um, and if it's just that, hey, look, I just want to say this and that's it, that's fine. But what I'm saying is, if in order to provide a concert
hmm,
for X amount of people, you have to pay people to work the parking lot, to pay the
yes,
this or that. So it's not just, well, I don't want to charge over $20. It's not just that. It's just in order to create, in order to establish a concert or whatever. I'm not talking like kill them,
yes,
with it, but there is, you have to
yes.
hire
There's
other
an
people.
overhead. Yes, there's an overhead. There is expenses, but that song on that other channel, which was Radio WV, Radio West Virginia, he's got music up on his channel. The popularity of that song has brought people over to his side. He's not hurting, but you got to remember this song is only about a month old. So he's getting subscribers and he's getting hits and he's getting views on his channel on his side. Some of these have been up for quite a while and didn't get any traction. But the popularity of that song on somebody else's channel, on Radio WV's channel, has drawn people to him. So he is making money from his music. But in his words, he's an okay singer and a mediocre guitar player. I wouldn't want the pressure to get up in front of 10,000 people and try to sing either. You know, Steve later added, um, he's planning another concert in the same city at about the same time, but limiting ticket prices to a max of 25 each. Okay. Okay. I mean, you can still bring in, you know, it, you get into that thing where it's a trade off. Do you want to sell 10,000 tickets at $100 a piece? Or do you want to sell 50,000 tickets at $25 a piece? Not only that, but yes, it is a PR move. No, I'm not going to sell tickets for $100. We're going to do the max at 25. That is a PR move.
Whatever he does,
But
and whatever the purpose. So he wrote a song.
mhm,
The song envelops a certain sense in the
mhm,
public at large, which people are feeling, and they've taken. It appears that they've taken to. I heard a song once or twice. I heard it twice, um, and and that was good enough for me. I mean,
mhm.
but there's people that are attached to it at a
Yes,
very deep level, probably. Um, if you're going to be the humble guy, and by the way, this is just me looking at the different
sure.
things. I'm not. He can do whatever he wants, obviously,
Yes,
but I'm thinking in terms of if in his mind is I'm just a songwriter and I wrote this song, and yes, it's um this fight for the common man
mhm,
against the established forces that be, but it's just a song and whatever. I don't
yeah,
really want to make this. And he's just in that little world. I, the missed opportunity is that if so many people want to see you, you have to create an infrastructure in order to, and that's going to cost money
I
because you have to
agree.
pay people.
Yeah,
So you're basically creating an industry from yourself, and that concept, if he doesn't understand it, then he doesn't understand it. But basically, the ball is left the Elvis's limousine left the station,
mhm.
and it's down, and you're not driving that car. You can influence it, but now it's become an industry, and in
Well,
order to get that message even solidified more and more and more, you need to provide the service for people to hear it.
right. Yeah, and I'm with you. He did do an interview with Joe Rogan. Now, I haven't watched it. I've seen a couple clips from it. He was kind of blindsided by it. He didn't expect any of this.
Sixty
None of
thousand,
it.
60 million is
Yeah.
not.
But again,
That's
that's not on his channel. That's on Radio WV. That's on a different channel. Now, that's not to say that they aren't paying him. I don't know what their deal is. I really don't. But and he's also getting a good amount of revenue coming in off of his channel just because of his name now. But it kind of blindsided him. He didn't expect it, and it is overwhelming him. And
Jim.
undoubtedly, he's got people around him now.
Jim gave us a number.
Yeah, Jim Dockrell is saying 40,000 a day. I don't know. Yeah, he turned down an $8 million contract, but gets 40,000 a day for his music independently. I don't know. I've not seen that. I really don't know. You may be 100% right. But for
And he's
that
got
kind of
60.
money, but for
Yeah.
that kind of money, you can put people around him. Believe me. I would imagine the limousines from New York are surrounding his 5 acres, trying to get him to sign this a contract or one form or another.
Yeah, no, the guy is basically so what for whatever it's worth,
Mhm.
it's just a good example of going back to the beginning of music, because we were talking about soulless music, or at least I was.
And music that makes an emotional connection. Yeah.
Yeah, and so can you say, I mean, I know I'll even be bold and say that I'll include you in this one, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one. But there's no pick your poison, Shay or Mickey Mamaj, or any number of these pop singers. I get it. There's people
Hmm.
that love them, but and I guess people have emotional connection to that, obviously too. But maybe I'm an outcast. No, I am to some degree, but I find it ridiculously, extremely shallow to even circumnavigate the world in which this pop music that
Well,
people fling themselves to. Um,
but
like a black hole of soul sucking whatever. That's how I look at that pop world.
Well, that's how it's always been. That's how pop music has always been. It's always been the depth of pop music is about 3 molecules deep.
Yeah, but I don't feel the
And it's
same way.
and it's always been that way though. I mean,
But I
th-
don't feel the same
there's
way
not a
about.
lot of depth in sugar sugar all honey honey.
But
There's
I
not a
don't.
lot of depth in a red rubber ball. I mean,
Yeah, but
you
I
know.
don't find. Okay, sugar, sugar, honey, honey
Mhm.
is different, and red rubber ball is different in my mind, and it's not the same thing. And I don't know how to organize it so that I can put it forth as to why, but I can generally tell you that there's this debauchery
Okay, yeah, well, yeah,
type.
I will agree with you on that.
There's a difference between an innocent
I'll agree
little
with you.
jingle and this world of everything that is not valuable as far as what's what. Look, at the end of the day, to one extreme or the other, due to the fact that I'm biased for me being
Mhm,
born in the, but there are things that are of the earth
mhm.
and of goodness. And by the way, no one's good in my opinion. I think that we're all, as per the Christian doctrine, I think that we're all. I mean, we're all so incredibly
People are
foul. I mean,
people.
I just, exactly. But I can't point to that music, that
Well, you can't
techno.
identify it. You can't identify with it.
I can't point. No, but what's worse, it also has a sense of, obviously, is my opinion, of this soul sucking debauchery, evil, shallow, useless. Um, you know, what are you laughing about?
I'm not making light of you, but you sound exactly like my mother when I brought home my first Black Sabbath album.
And can you see that? Well, let's look at
But
that.
it was a different era. It was a different time.
But that's not all
We
that's
were
different
coming
about
out
it.
of the 50s and 60s, and she just thought that this was the worst, absolute worst stuff that you could listen to. And I'm like, oh yeah,
Yeah, but I get that, and
you know.
okay, but
But it was just the similarity in the way you were talking. It sounded
okay,
it was giving me flashbacks, man.
okay, but Black Sabbath, if you listen to their lyrics and listen to their music, like I
Right.
understand, so you can identify something as negative or evil,
Hmm.
and have that apply to a million things. I understand the similarity because you heard
Hmm.
my reaction to the thing, but there's no way, and you can.
No, you can't equate the music. And I'm not trying to do that. The only thing I was equating was what you were saying about today's music, which I happen to agree with you on, and what I was being told about my music when I was growing up. It was the epitome of evil and debauchery and all things wrong with the world. And my argument to that was what it's doing is it's pointing out the wrong in the world and it's telling you that it's wrong, you know.
Yeah, but okay,
And there is no comparison because what's going on now is the glorification of all that it's wrong. It's not telling you it's wrong, it's telling you that you're wrong if you don't get in on this.
okay, right. So Black Sabbath does have, and there's dark music out there and this and that. Look, dude, this is a complicated, but I'm gonna throw this out too. And okay, I get what you're saying, and so fair enough. And again, my bias is gonna be replaying.
Sure.
But here's the thing: a heavy metal album,
Hmm.
not the cup of tea of neither my mom, my dad,
Hmm.
surely, but within that album, even though it's talking of dark things and this and that,
Hmm.
there is there are doors that, due to what's going on in the songs and stuff in a general sense, that allows the person listening, yes, it's thrashing and this and that, but there's intent of complexity that if kids of the era wanted to, maybe they ended up, oh, magicians, and then they explore. There's complex. Whereas with this, it's a cheap thrill, but
Yeah,
it's a cheap thrill.
it's a dopamine hit.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it a thrill. I listen to it and it's like, it's like sunlight to a vampire.
Well, you can go back to Greg and the Nigerian prince. You're not their target. They don't want you.
Then that's another problem.
They want the ones who are easily swayed by this.
Even songs like from the '80s, like "Never Gonna Give You Up," "Never Gonna Let You
You want
Down,"
to
"Never
talk about a
Gonna,"
plastic banana? Go for it.
even that
Mhm.
is better than the crap.
Yeah, it was pretty benign. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
there is that jingle benign thing, and then there's this,
Well,
because
no, yeah,
even the heavy metal wasn't telling you to go, you
no,
know,
no.
you know,
Well, you look at War Pigs. We're on Black Sabbath. War Pigs was probably one of the greatest anti-war songs ever written. But if you don't sit down and listen to it, you won't know that. And that's what I was up against. They wouldn't listen to that. So they had no idea the message that was being conveyed. All they saw was an album cover and heard a name, and that was it. And that was enough.
there's an intellectual. There's also another thing,
Mhm.
which I'm gonna have to give it to rap to a degree, but not. I'm gonna have to give it to rap, but I'm gonna have to take it away from rap, and this is my biased opinion. I give it to rap, and then I take it away for this reason. It's but heavy metal allowed for intellectual discourse. You may not be a person out there too into intellectual, but it allowed for the possibility of being thoughtful, even amidst this junga 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 junga. But there's a thoughtful. Okay, so there's possibility there. There's thoughtfulness involved, and the thoughtfulness involved, can lead you down different roads and this and that. But whatever. So, there were things like "We're Not Gonna Take It," which is a jingle type song.
Right.
But it was a good thrill thing. But the rock and roll world, you can't speak for all of them, but there was the possibility of deeper thought. People might not value deeper thought, but that's a dangerous prospect, and to whatever degree. This pop world encourages simpleton
Yes.
thinking and shallow, vain acquiring of like, what the hell's up? And by the way, I give it to rap in that their lyrical content, or I'm sorry, their lyrical powers
Mhm.
of lyric jingling around in order to create a string of things. That's freaking crazy stuff. But I take it right back away, and not all of them, but for whatever it's worth, the ones that do promoting, and it's their prerogative if they do. It's their choice. But promoting the most shallow, less than, you get what I'm saying. It's
I do.
all
Promoting
shallow.
the superficial and the sybaritic excess, get it now. And there's no limits. There's no control. Do what you want, do it now. And let's get explicit about it. Don't control your emotions. It's nobody else's business. Go get yours now. And there was that kind of a spirit in some of the early 70s music, but it wasn't explicit. It wasn't thrown right in your face. The language was different. The the feeling and the emotion was different. Now, some songs they may have been saying exactly the same thing, but it wasn't as abrupt. It wasn't as explicit and in your face. Um, it's I don't even go that deep. I just say it's not my style of music. I think some of it could be with some tweaking. But let's also, and this is my bias, let's also have a little bit of originality. Don't just take clips from 4 or 5 songs that other people have written and throw together your own musical composition based on those. Come up with your own musical composition, come up with your own melody. You can do it if you want to, but it's easier to take clips. Oh, I like that. Let's sample that. Well, what's original about that? Well, it's original in the way I put all these samples together. Well, how about you just come up with that and you play that?
because they're not musicians in the traditional sense.
True.
And Frankie, point taken. There is a fair of bias going on here with at least my interpretations of things, but I have no choice but to be. I mean, I could be the other way, but I don't feel like it. I don't.
Well,
I don't.
and there's a lot of the rock and roll that I didn't like. There's a lot of rock bands I didn't like, you know? So it wasn't like, well, rock and roll gets an automatic pass. No, if I like your sound, I like your sound. If I don't, I just don't. And there's nothing you can say that's going to make me change that.
I understood back in the
You know?
day why my father and my mother weren't keen
Hmm.
on the heavy metal.
Yeah.
I understood even back
Yeah.
then
So did I.
reasonably that that this is not what they were exposed to. And funny enough, the rock and roll from the 50s, like anytime I talk to my dad about rock and roll, he'd all say, "Oh, I like Elvis Presley."
Hmm. Yeah.
So 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 his reference point and joyful too, to a degree,
Yeah.
Elvis Presley was the limit of wildness.
Yeah. Well, they grew up in a different era. And when Elvis was first on TV, that was wild. I mean, they shot him from the chest up, you know?
Even though, so there's also something to be said about, I guess, modesty standards in terms of, um, there's also been gatekeeping throughout the history. I'm not, you can point to any part of the world, but I'm talking about the US of A right now. You can point out other, but there has been a tradition long ago in within the 20th century and prior, but let's say within our century prior, of keeping guard at the gates of, I don't know, anything from how high,
Hmm.
how short is your bathing suit, or how,
Yeah.
what not to or to do, at what time of hour to be able to
Hmm.
come home, and all these things. And so there was a guarding of that because it seemed that that's the glue that kept society together in a general sense.
Yeah. There was a certain societal standard that you had to kind of keep because if you didn't, you weren't going to get a recording deal.
And then on the edges,
Mhm.
on the fringes of that society, you had people that were always pushing the envelope, um,
Right.
getting in their little hits here and there.
Hmm.
And if you take it to its full conclusion, we end up where we're at right now. So, I mean, Elvis Presley, they say, I read it in a couple of books, and I don't know if it's true or not because you know how that is, but
Yeah.
Elvis Presley is said to have said to government officials that the Beatles were a danger to the youth of America.
I've never heard that, but okay. I'll take it at face value.
Well, I preempted it by saying I've read it in
Yeah.
various books, but that, you know, I'm not sure of the details, but I have read it in actually, I've read it in the Beatles book when talking about the time. So back in the day, I used to read way more like biographies and this and that, and I like music biographies. And yeah, I believe it was from one of the Beatles. See, now,
Hmm.
now my lights are flashing. Oh, they stopped. Um, and they said that when the Beatles met Elvis the one and only time as a group,
Hmm.
because Harrison met him later and whatnot, they later found out it was Paul McCartney that actually said it. So Paul McCartney is quoted as saying, and this is from my memory, so I'm paraphrasing, that Elvis went to government officials and said that no, we don't. I don't think that the Beatles are good for so. And Paul said, "Well, I was a little upset about that."
Okay, Steve says he'd heard that also, and it was told to J. Edgar Hoover, who was the
Okay,
head of the FBI at the time.
okay, and Paul was he Paul's and by the way, Paul was a huge. Paul has Elvis's bass player's bass,
Yeah.
so he's a big fan. But to hear something like that
Mhm.
from from one of your musical idols later in life, as more news comes out, you
Mhm.
start to hear that, and so he was a little bit upset about that. So for an Elvis or people of that generation, even things coming out in the 70s um, were starting to be a little bit, but
Yeah.
not to even mention 80s, 90s, and today. So we have gone, and they weren't wrong in essentially that if society, they're not wrong, but that doesn't mean that they should or should society should or shouldn't through legislation and such. But they weren't wrong that these things, these standards, are standards that do keep a certain front facing um, mantle
Hmm.
over the dining room table in order to keep things tidy. And yes, things can crumble in terms
Sure.
of people's relations and activities under the mantle, that tablecloth. But that mantle does serve a purpose to sort of like embank, society. So standards are beneficial if you're thinking in those terms. I'm
Yeah.
not suggesting that anything other. I'm just saying that I could
Well,
see its benefit.
there were rules and regulations on various things, content, what have you. I mean, there was a reason why Ricky and Lucy slept in separate beds
Hmm.
on TV,
Yeah.
and because there were regulations of what could be broadcast and what couldn't be, and that started to break down in the 60s, the about the mid 60s on, that started to break down. And that's about the time that FM radio started to get popular, because I don't you weren't around at the time, but it was the 60s were very, very turbulent. The 60s and early 70s. It was a major generational divide where the younger people were rebelling against anything and everything that was considered to be mainstream or adult. I mean, I can remember people, oh no, don't trust anybody over 30 years old. I can remember that being told to me, not by a teacher, but by other people in school. Oh, you can't trust anybody over 30. That divide grew. And that's when FM radio started going more freeform and started getting more and more popular. It started with campus radio stations because you could get a low power FM station set up for relatively little money. And at the end of the broadcast day, when the student DJs were done playing the news and playing the pop music that was needed to be played during the day to satisfy the faculty, they could get a lot more free form. And that's where guys like Jimi Hendrix started getting popular. You never heard Jimi Hendrix on AM radio, but you heard it on FM radio, especially if you lived close to a college or university that had a radio station. Then pretty soon more FM stations started sprouting up here and there, but they were all fairly low power because it was inexpensive to start. You still had rules and regulations, but you didn't have a programming director in your face telling you what you had to play, because it was supposed to be completely counterculture. It was counter to all things that AM radio stood for. And yes, it was more permissive. It still wasn't explicit because they still had language laws that they had to follow by. They had certain topics they couldn't touch. And I want to say that started a Supreme Court case because I want to say it was WAOI in New York, an FM station, played George Carlin's Seven Words You Can't Say on Television. And it was all of the big ones, all of the big curse words that would get us yanked off of YouTube.
Yeah.
They played that comedy bit and were immediately slapped by the FCC. And they took it to court, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they won that was a violation of their free speech rights. And from that point on, things changed. Some of the standards went away. There is nothing more wholesome than this TV show if you step back and look at it. But the first TV show that ever even hinted that a man and a woman slept in the same bed, believe it or not, was the Brady Bunch. And there was one scene in one episode where the kids came into mom and dad's bedroom. Mom and dad are in a king size bed, way separated from one another, but they're under the covers in the same bed. And that's the first time that was ever shown on television. So a lot of that stuff started to go away. And music, television, the movies all kind of followed pace with it. So
Yeah.
I don't know, in some ways, this may be the natural evolution of where we have gone. I imagine there's a whole lot of an attempt at shock value. Let's see, can I make the most shocking thing that, for whatever purpose. I imagine there's some of that. But I also imagine that they are trying to appeal to a certain segment of the public at large, and they've been successful. I don't know what's in their minds. I don't know what's in their hearts. Maybe it is all just about the money. So let's make this, get it out, and somebody give me in the next song. But
It,
I agree with you on several levels there.
if you think, well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm just basically soulless. So,
If you think about, with all all that you said, and towards the end, if you think about a group like Metallica
mhm,
as an example, it could be anybody, but just let's use Metallica. They wouldn't be looked at twice. Their long hair, dressed in black, the
yeah,
chain, the studs.
that's
If that was commonplace, if any downtown back in the 80s, you'd walk into any gift shop or any whatever, any Walgreens or whatever, um, and everybody and their mother and their grandmother were dressed to the hilt with all the regalia, with leather and whatnot. So these people are pressing the bounds of what you have, this inner core, which is your normal society, and there's variation there, but it's still in a neat packaged format. And then at the outskirts, you have these musicians and poets,
mhm,
the artistic types, pushing the envelope, looking and acting erratic in some cases, things that make the core uncomfortable
yeah,
because in many cases, as we've heard, people and parents would complain that it will influence our children, and hence that core starts to slip into other possibilities other than the nucleus that they've established for such a long time. And so these people, Frank Zappa, all these people pushing the envelope more, Madonna, pushing the envelope more and more and more and more and more and more. Well, my point in saying this is that none of these envelope pushers, these great musicians and artists and poets and actors,
mhm,
none of them would exist nor have a leg if the opposite were true. In other words, if the opposite didn't exist, which is your normies, let's say,
mhm,
your standard, your regular people, the people that
mhm,
keep the core together. So, in the absence of the norm that created these people, or that allowed them to do their excess, they would be neither here nor there. So, not only is it important to press push the envelope, so we have these great creations, but it's also important to recognize, and this is what a lot of people, I, I, I I'm gonna suggest, um, miss in this whole cultural thing. We may point to these people as like they used to do the squares,
Hmm.
because they're all about keeping this sort of, continuity and this and that. But without those squares, these people
Right.
that tiptoed down the hallway of society in order to explore wouldn't have become successes, because um, they had to escape that in order to
Yeah.
become that.
You
But
have to have something to rebel against in order to be seen a rebel.
exactly. But in doing that tiptoe down that hallway of culture, once they get to that radical area, if enough people try um change their if enough people move from the inner core over to those extremes, and that inner core disappears, that stable society, regular people, just normal, this and that and whatever, then those people cease to exist, because they eat themselves, because those
Yes.
people are all about going so radical that,
Right.
let's do away with norms, do away with norms. So even in this musical context, what I'm getting at is you need a balance. We
Yeah.
need to accommodate for all people in terms of culture, in terms of, we need to
And
accommodate so that radicals can go out and explore, and people can enjoy that,
mhm.
but the core needs to be protected too. And I think many people have forgotten about the core.
Well, many people have forgotten about the core. You're absolutely right on that. And there's always Dan, how are you? So speaking of eating yourself, here I am. Yeah. Uh howdy, Dan. That core, however, represents the mainstream of society. And I do believe there's an audience for everything and everybody. And yes, the outliers are going to get a lot of attention. At first, it's going to be finger pointing like, oh, look at these guys. Aren't they funny? Oh, look at these guys. Let's laugh at them. But pretty soon, they try to normalize the outliers and make that appear to be average. And the people who are the mainstream are looking back going, no, wait a minute. No, wait, no, they're not the mainstream. They are the outliers. And that's where you get that friction coming in back and forth. I see it as another, I hesitate to say fad because a fad is, a meteoric rise, then a quick plummet. Look at disco. That was a fad. Part of me also says that disco was a part of the natural evolution of music, but then it died a rapid death almost as quickly as it was that meteoric rise. I mean, it was a spike in the musical timeline. I do see some of hip hop as a natural evolution, but I also see it as, I won't say a dead end street, but the road gets narrower the further it goes, if that makes any sense to me. And soon, it's already happening little by little. People are jumping off, and getting into R&B and pop and things of that nature. They're not leaving hip hop behind, but the more explicit and radical versions of hip hop they are starting to leave behind. It's kind of like, okay, I've made my money, I've got my fame. Now I don't want to be on the stage anymore. I want to be the producer behind the scenes, putting forth other acts. And they're getting out of that one genre and into others. It's kind of hard to explain. It's hard for me to articulate, but you can hear it, you can see it. It's not like it was in the 90s. It's not like it was in the 2000s. It has evolved yet again. The boy bands had their day. Now the girl groups are up on top. You look at who the big draws are. They're all women. that too is going to eventually go away and something else will take its place. Now, it may still be in that hip hop genre, but the subject matter, the topics, the language now are completely different from 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, God knows where it's going to go. So that is one hopeful thing about music anyway, is it's always going to change. It's always going to evolve. I mean, you listen to a country song now versus a country song from the 80s and they're completely different animals. But they're still country and western.
I guess if we can run a parallel to the other thing prior, of the nucleus as opposed to the outliers that push the envelope and such. In terms of music specifically, I can associate, because two things. One, like we've talked about this, but music from back in the early 1900s,
Mm-hmm.
they were super outrageously popular and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Today, people, if asked, they won't know who the heck these people were, and yet
No,
these were
yeah.
people that created music that was in movies and films and such.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you think of roots music
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like blues and folk and country and all these things, um, even calypso and just roots music in
Mm-hmm.
general, as time goes on, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's going to be that it's going to be that root type music that people could always refer back to
Yeah.
as a refresher course from the excesses that they've gotten to. So anytime I hear roots music, which includes reggae, um, old Cuban music, because it's
Mm-hmm.
Afro Cuban music, which is a blending of jazz with congas and whatnot. It's kind of like what Santana. That Santana's
Mm-hmm.
music is basically Cuban music. Um, Stuff like that. Banjo music. What do they call it?
Bluegrass.
Bluegrass music. Just all these, blues and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the station. It's the bus returning to the station for repairs,
Yeah.
as opposed to these excesses of these shallow things in the.
Yeah.
So, as long as the roots music remain, kind of like, imagine old Irish songs that have been
Mm-hmm.
around for so long that it's forgotten into
Dude,
the past.
Metallica did a cover of Whiskey in the Jar. That's an Irish folk song. I mean, that song's older than the hills. So, yes. And people do return to that roots music and make new versions of it and do covers of it. I mean, look at Cream with Crossroads Blues. I mean, Robert Johnson didn't live long enough to see Eric Clapton, but thousands of musicians have covered Robert Johnson's songs. Same thing with Muddy Waters. Thousands of musicians have covered their songs. They've adopted their style. I mean, I heard it said that blues and jazz got together and had a baby and they named it rock and roll. I happen to agree with that because you can pick a rock and roll song and you can find elements of it that trace back to blues and trace back to jazz. And I don't care what song you pick, you'll find elements there from both. And that's the beautiful thing about it, is because it will always change. You may not know it when you're hearing it, but you will find things in some of Eddie Van Halen's riffs or some of his playing that he picked up from Bach. Or there are clips of Angus Young in down in their concert at the River Platte where he's playing Bach just during a break as kind of a finger exercise, and the crowd's going nuts. It's going to come back and it's going to go ahead, and it's going to come back and it's going to go ahead. I mean, they're remaking 70s and 80s songs now. which kind of gives me a little bit of hope. But there are some things you just don't mess with. Don't touch Boston.
There's this commercial just talking about the degradation degradation of music, at least in my mind. This is my bias again. But there's a commercial that I've run into every now and again, and I don't know what they're hoping, because for me, again, the Nigerian prince, it's not going to work. It might psychologically deep down, one day, out of sheer desperation or tossing caution to the wind. But there's a Burger King commercial, and the tune, if you remember the tune, we've had, oh whoa whoa whoa, what a feeling, Toyota, and all the
Yeah.
nice little things. And those are all jingles that are. You can think of them as they're jingles, but you can think of them almost as nursery level,
Yeah.
simple rhymes,
Yeah.
which
Nursery
is,
rhymes. Yeah.
and that's the purpose of them, so that
Hmm.
people, while they're
Something to
whistling
get
while they
stuck in your
work,
head. Yeah.
right? Well, but here's the thing: I ran into a Burger King frickin' commercial,
Hmm.
and this is the jingle. I'm gonna paraphrase the singing, but
Hmm.
use it. Burger King. Oh yeah, Burger King, in a rap style thing, like a group with
Hmm.
that voice. But like, have you heard rap and they try to sing, but they're not singers? Have you heard that in the past?
Yeah, I
There's a
have.
style, and
Yeah.
they're all out of key and stuff. Well, Burger King, some a group of people decided to sit down, and the advertising department said, this is what's going to attract most people, that because they're into this type of thing, and this is the music. So they settled on an out of key, have it your way, and it's like that, like the voices are off key and this and that with a stupid beat,
Cringy.
cringy, just horrible. You want to I don't even want to say what it makes me want to think, and because I might, but see, I'm even freaking editing myself, as the current thing. Richmond, north of Richmond, he's right. um because back in the day, I wouldn't edit myself. I would have said three or four things that
Yeah.
today would be unspeakable. And not just me, all my friends,
Oh yeah.
unspeakable. And we'd say it, and guess what? Nothing happened.
Well, but
Um,
but when you're that age, you don't care, and you're there for shock value as well.
in any event, no, and it wouldn't be. No, what my point is, that it wouldn't be shocking. It'd just be a thing. But in
Hmm.
today's climate, one is always measuring, and that's because of the programming. But this Burger King thing, it's so, and so it made me think, wow, just
How
10
low
years
have we
ago,
sunk? Yeah.
20 years ago, they wouldn't have dreamt of doing a commercial like that, because it's such
Well,
an insult to the, in my opinion, to the brand.
but look at who the jingle writers were back in the day. Do you know the most prolific jingle writer of the 70s and 80s? The guy who wrote the most jingles for the most brands. You happen to know who it was? Give
Wait,
you a hint. He plays piano.
he plays piano?
Hmm.
I don't know.
Barry Manilow.
Oh, okay, I knew that he wrote jingles, but I didn't know.
I'm stuck on Band-Aid because Band-Aid stuck on me. That was him. My baloney has a first name. It's OSC. That was him. I mean, there was a whole bunch of them. The guy wrote that. That's how he survived, was writing jingles.
So did Roy Orbison.
Yeah. After
So
his,
so
eh,
did so did the Stranger in Red. What's his name? Um
Lady in Red.
no, Stranger in Red. He wrote the redheaded stranger guy.
Willie Nelson.
Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson
Hmm.
also did jingles.
Yeah. But Barry Manilow just basically was writing. He said he'd sit down at the piano. He'd write 5 or 6 just at a sitting, and he just was pumping them out, and that's how he survived. Basically, he went from being Bette Midler's piano player to writing jingles to then Mandy got real hot and he took off from there. But and then I write the songs and all that other good stuff, and became every mother's heartthrob.
What was that
But
song? The hottest place south of north
oh,
of
the
Havana.
Copacabana. Yes,
Copacabana.
my
At the
ex-wife,
Copa.
my ex-wife loved that song, which showed her depth.
Copacabana. I mean, it's so, well, whatever.
that showed her depth, you know.
At the Copa. It's almost sounds like that what do you call those singers that they talk while they sing uh like jazz stand up.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's a name for it.
Not a torch singer.
They're like, hey everybody, I'm here to sing a couple of tunes tonight.
Yeah, and
Oh, hey
I
my
can't think of the
baby,
lounge singers.
lounge singer.
Yes, I
It's
couldn't
so
think of the
great.
words. Yeah.
No, but even that is good though. Even compared to the crowd, I'd rather
What
hear
what I
20
like
hours
is
of straight lounge singers. Go
I'll
ahead.
be straight. What I like is realism. What I like is realism. Make it real. Make it authentic.
Let's
Like
go to
like
Vegas, honey.
look at Los Lonely Boys. Their song Heaven.
Yeah.
I don't care what the lyrics say. That's just good music that I want to listen to.
No, it's not a bad song. It's a great
No,
song.
it's a great song. But
How far is
now
heaven?
you take what
Oh,
I'm getting at is though you take the lyrics away from it and it's just good music. I want to hear that. Now you add those lyrics in and you jump it up a huge notch. I mean, I don't care who did it. I don't care why. I'm just happy that they did.
but that's different than, hey baby, why don't you roll down to my side? I won't get you
Yeah,
in.
you know,
Like all that. It's like
well, again, I can't identify with it.
I got gold chains. I
And
got
I'm not
gold rings.
their target audience. And, so fine.
My point is that a one song
Hmm.
within an album,
Hmm.
fine. An excess song of this. Well, to be fair with what Frankie said before, this is all because rock and roll has the thing. But
Yeah.
and again, it's the bias. But I can't help to think. Yes, there were, but like one of the most. I can't even say that there were heavy metal bands that sure did excess with the talk about chicks and this, and that.
Oh
Like look at
yeah, big
Motley Crue.
time.
Um, so there is that too. What kind of poison do you want? I guess is the thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know, dude. It's biased at the end of the day. But
Oh, it's 100% biased because again, it's easier to identify what you don't like than it is to identify what you like. You know,
yeah,
I can sit here right now and I can say I don't like Hank Williams Sr. I'm not a country fan. A lot of people just got cheesed off at me right now. Just not my style of music. Nothing against him. He was successful. He's a country legend. Not taking a thing away from him. Not my style of music.
you know
But
what
I
the
can
best
say the exact same thing about Mariah Carey. Very successful. Great voice. Not my style of music.
one of the best one of the best ways to drive down a lonesome highway here in Florida back 30 years ago with your buddy driving
Mhm.
down the road, all pine trees along each side, dark, as you're driving, is listening to old or stopping at mid journey into the barbecue place is listening to Hank Williams Sr. Because of the low quality of the audio and the environment, it gives you a vibe of being transported back into the
Now,
1950s. It's so insane, but I get what you're saying.
now, this is the difference between you living in that area and me being a West Coast kid that's never experienced it. Because as you're describing that to me, the group that came to my mind was Creedence Clearwater. You know,
Okay,
and pick a song. It doesn't matter which song. It could have been anything from Born on the Bayou to Green River to Have You Ever Seen the Rain? Just, but the mental image I got when you were describing that, I just Credence goes with it.
to wrap up this part of the thing, or if you have more things to, if I were to pick an image
Hmm.
for me, and not just today, and I'm not just saying that today, I'm saying
Hmm.
way back since I even started the journey of learning guitar and exploring the
Hmm.
thing. If I had to tell you about the spark and imagery that started it all, it's a blues man sitting on some sort of cart on along a highway, no one else around, guitar case in hand. that imagery, and the future is a question mark. But he's going somewhere to play and live out his
Mhm.
experience.
Moving on to the next town. Yeah.
That image, and where did that image come from? That image came from Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
It came from the musicians that paid homage or homage. Um, I can never get that one, but to him in their songs. That is the beginning. It's not the beginning, in effect, but for me, it's the start of the movie. That moment, because from there came Jimi Hendrix. From there came BB King. From there came all the others rolling down the
Yeah.
pike.
Yeah.
Chuck Berry, Little Richard,
John
um,
Lee Hooker.
Jerry Lee
Yeah.
Lewis, all of them,
Yeah.
all of them.
Muddy
That
Waters.
image, that to me is the iconic American image. That
Yeah.
bluesman sitting on a
Yeah.
apple carton or
Yeah.
crate, and yeah,
You don't get much more Americana than that. You're absolutely right. And this is completely different genre, different everything. But that was one of the endearing aspects of the Traveling Wilburys because they took on that persona.
they did.
The- Just five, six gigging musicians
Mhm. You're right.
going down the road to the next gig.
Yeah, that was their imagery.
Hmm.
Although the music was more advanced into, but it was still that country, that rock, that
Yeah.
feel, that but their imagery of that spirit
Hmm.
also feels like it started there.
Dude, it's in their music videos. I mean, Handle with Care, they're all standing around a microphone hanging from the ceiling in a warehouse. But at the end, they're all sitting in front of a train on old pieces of furniture. At the beginning of the video, they're all in an old pickup with their logo on the side that pulls up to the camera and stops. Then the end of the line, they're on that train. They're just sitting around playing and singing. I mean, it is the imagery, and you can sit there and say you could argue plausibly that it was the superstar appeal of Tom Petty, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Jim Keltner. You could make that argument, and I would not argue with you at all. You could say that that was their appeal, but it doesn't matter who's singing. If you don't like the sound, nothing's going to make you listen to it. And that just it brought back a resurgence to me anyway in roots music. And it was interesting to hear you use that term because not many people use that term anymore. I think that's kind of gone by the wayside, but it's 100% accurate.
That was
And
the appeal. That was the appeal of the Doors to me. But at the same time, they pushed the envelope into the psychedelic. But they did root themselves in that blues. If you listen to some of their songs, like
yeah,
"The
yeah,
Car
well,
Sits by My Window" and
yeah, Roadhouse Blues. I mean, right there. I mean, there it
"Roadhouse
is.
Blues" is the perfect example.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't get
Um,
more American than that.
well, we were talking about biases earlier. Okay, let me say I like the Doors. I like to listen to their music. Morrison Hotel is, I think, my favorite Doors song,
It's a great album.
or song album. Um, but I remember when the Doors came out, and the first song I heard, I think probably the first song anybody heard by the Doors in any kind of a pop setting was "Light My Fire,"
Yeah.
and they always seemed strange to me. And I don't mean strange as what's that, but strange in a weird,
Yeah.
detached kind of way.
Yep, they were. They
And
sure were.
but that was the initial impression. I remember seeing them on TV, and I don't remember what show it was. My dad didn't like Ed Sullivan, so I know it wasn't the Ed Sullivan show, but I saw them on something. And it just struck me as these guys are weird. They're not different in the way Three Dog Night was. Three Dog Night was one of the most underrated bands in history,
There
my
was something
opinion.
forbidden with the Doors.
Yes, there was something forbidden and foreboding. Like you
Mhm.
didn't know what was going to happen, and you
And it
didn't know
wasn't
if
good.
you didn't know if you were going to like it exactly. It's kind of like a present from your grandma. You didn't know what was in it, but you were pretty sure you weren't going to like it.
Yeah, yeah. The Doors, um, because it was just the themes that they decided on was carnival. What was that?
Daniel says because they were high as kites. Yeah, that could be a big part of it.
Yeah, they
But
were, but so were other people. But
I
they
was getting ready to say, and growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 60s, everybody there was high as kites, just about.
But the thing is that they decided on, they grabbed onto the blues
Mm-hmm.
as a foundation. But then this Jim Morrison read a lot of philosophical and weird stuff that's not typical of the people that push the envelope of society. And he introduced, in a limited way as songs are, little whatnots of concepts that left much to the imagination. But then you have this carnival music going on because of
Mm-hmm.
the the organ
Well,
that Manzarek was playing.
well,
And then you have all, so
you got
to
to
this day they're weird.
you got to remember there's a reason why they called that era acid rock.
To
Okay,
this day the Doors are weird.
oh yeah, yeah, but there's a reason why they called that genre of music acid rock at the time. You know, we call it psychedelic music,
when
but
when the drummer
back then it was called acid rock, and that's all there was to it.
one of the one of the books that's highly worth, in my opinion, reading is John Densmore's book. I
Hmm.
forget the name of it, but it's John's, and in it, I'm paraphrasing. He said the first time Jim Morrison started singing,
Hmm.
to him it felt like it was an overreach
Hmm.
because he was trying to act or sing like an African American blues player in
Hmm.
his 50s,
Hmm.
and he was like a 20 something year old young guy.
Hmm.
And it struck him, and I'm elaborating on his the impressions. I haven't read that book in 20 some odd years, but it impressed him in that it felt faint. What's the word? Is it feigned? There's a word
Yeah,
that,
kind of feigned, kind of faked, kind of.
yeah,
You're trying too hard, dude. Knock it off.
yeah, it felt to him, but it
Mhm.
so ends up that it worked for him. But initially when
Mhm.
he heard it, he was like, "Well, what the heck?"
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
because he was singing like an old blues
Well,
player.
he was trying to, yeah. And when you get into something like, well, Roadhouse Blues, you can hear that in his voice. But then you get into Riders of the Storm, completely different. Now, I have respect for singers who can do that, who can switch back and forth, almost like going into a character and coming out of a character. Because if you can alter your sound like that, Bob Dylan, not one that you would think of in this context, because I don't know how much of it is under his control, but you take a song like, The Times They Are a Changin', and you play that back to back with Lay Lady Lay, there's no way you would know that that was the same guy singing both tunes if you weren't aware that it was Bob Dylan.
Yeah,
He can change his voice up at will, I believe, but you never know what you're going to get with him because he likes to change everything up so
I
much.
bought his 2 volume day by day, year by year,
Hmm.
um, episodic books,
Hmm.
and it was. I mean, I don't even know what happened to those books now, but back in the day, it was so awesome to read through. And in it, they talk about his singing style, a bunch of things, um, and uh, well, in any event, in my opinion, putting that to the side, in my opinion, his first album was the best album in terms of his voice. I'm sorry, his second album, his first and second album, but his second album, which was the one where he sings "Girl from the North Country," if you ever
Okay, yeah,
going to North Country
yeah,
Fair, and all that.
yeah,
That voice of his at that time, to me,
yeah.
was just perfect.
That was his heavy, heavy, pure folk days. Yeah,
That was his
before he,
perfect voice. After that, well, I
it
still
became a,
liked it.
it's a crapshoot. Now he's a brilliant songwriter. Don't get me wrong, but sometimes the man couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Other times, pitch perfect the whole way through. Knocking on heaven's door is in my list of top 20 favorite songs. And that was, and we got a little bit of radio play, but not a whole hell of a lot. But I heard it and I was like, oh man, who was that? I got to go get that. And then I found out it was Bob Dylan. I'm like, holy cow. And I went and got, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And I'd never been even tempted to buy a Bob Dylan album before, but that one opened the door to me.
I
But that,
bought a
but
bunch.
I don't know. This is one of those you've had discussions with guys who fought in Vietnam, for example, and you'll hear them use the phrase, you don't know, you can't understand, you had to be there. That is kind of, I don't know if it was the time we were growing up or if it was the limited exposure we had to various things. We were basically at the mercy of Madison Avenue and advertising. But the radio, it can't be overstressed how important the radio was to us growing up, because that was the only way you found music. If you didn't hear a song on the radio, you had no clue that that person existed out there. They may have made 70 albums, but if you didn't hear their music on the radio, it didn't matter. And then the switching back and forth between AM and FM, depending upon who you're with and whose car you're in, or whose house you're visiting, or what have you. That's how you got exposed to new music. And then friends with older brothers and sisters, or friends with younger brothers and sisters. But the radio was vitally important back then for information, but more importantly for music and pop culture.
Yeah.
You know,
Um. So, an aside within this, one of the most monumental for me, I had early on, a long time ago, I was a little kid, bought a compilation of the Beach Boys. One of the ones where they did back in the day, where it had this nice surfer type look on the cover,
mm-hmm.
but like a more modernized from back in the day look, where it was like the
Yeah,
blue turquoise looking and it said Beach Boys on it. It was like a compilation just for people to
mm-hmm.
get into. And I brought that home, and the acapella,
Yeah. There's
sounds.
nothing like Beach Boys harmonies. There's nothing like Beach Boys harmonies.
Unless you're looking at a barber shop quartet, which is what they're going after, to a degree. But it was impressive. And I listened to that for a long time, but I didn't know until somehow I ended up bumping into the idea that there's an album called Pet Sounds, and
Mm-hmm.
people kept mentioning it, or wherever I stumbled, they'd say, you got to listen to this. And I eventually bought it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember vaguely, but I can remember opening that and smelling the paperwork, the
Mm-hmm.
cover,
Yeah.
and smelling that ink
Yep.
smell, and putting it on and opening the page to the insert thing, where an article 3 or 4 pages in explained about the album,
Mm-hmm.
and I was blown away that they wrote an article explaining the music
Mm-hmm.
and the different scenarios and musicians, and I started reading that, and it hooked me in the headspace as far and in the heart space at the same time. And at the end it said who the article was from, and so I just from that point on, Pet Sounds was the best.
Yep.
um no joke, it was like crazy. Well, the article, this part's where I'm going to mess this up, was written by the what's the word,
The producer.
promoter, not producer, is somebody that promotes or advertise, like it was the same guy that did another famous band. It's either the Beatles, it was the Beatles, the same guy that used to promote the Beatles and write articles of intricate,
Mm-hmm.
did this insert.
Mm-hmm.
And what the guy was good at was creating a legend behind the story of a record or album or
Mm-hmm.
band. And that concept stuck with me all my life, on a musical level, because it's not just a throwaway thing. It's also the
Yes.
thought that was put into creating the album and stuff. I forget the name of the guy, but
And that's why and that's why right there, one reason why people still have the argument today over what was the first progressive rock album. Was it Sergeant Pepper or was it Pet Sounds?
it was Pet Sounds.
Yeah, and I will not argue either one of them. I will not
No,
argue either one
Pet Sounds.
because I can see the case for both.
Pet Sounds
But
came out first.
I understand that it came out first, but you have detractors that say no, it wasn't progressive, it was this, and you have other people who say Sergeant Pepper was this. I mean, the argument rages, it goes back and forth. But anyway, I think the argument could be made plausibly that that is one of the reasons why, because you got the explanation. There was a backstory to the music. There was a reason for the music beyond just let's throw out fun till her daddy takes the T-bird away. I mean, that had its place in time, but that wasn't the story. The story is what you read in that insert. And in a lot of ways, I kind of feel sorry for the music lover of today on a steady diet of today's music because they don't get that.
Yeah.
We did a one of our first episodes was titled "The Album Concept is Dead," and you and I talked about, you know, when we were of younger age, 15, 16, 14, something like that, going over to a friend's house just to listen to a new album he bought, that was an activity that we did. You know, my grandson has no concept of that. Why would you go over to somebody's house just to listen to an album? Because it was new and it was exciting, and I didn't have the album yet. Or if I got an album, I would call it, hey, I got this album. You guys want to come over and listen? I called 5 or 6 friends, and maybe 3 of them could go outside. They weren't on restriction or grounded for something, and go over and listen to the record.
They used to have cocktail parties back in the day.
Oh my God. It was when my dad brought home the soundtrack to the movie Woodstock. It was a 3 album set, 6 sides of music. That was unheard of to me. It was an endless parade of kids coming in and out of the house to listen to that 6 album set over the course of several days. I mean, my mother's like, "You got to knock this off." I'm like, "Well, my friends want to hear it, you know." So I was like, "Well, tell them to go buy it themselves." Mom, it's $5, you know, which was a chunk of change back then, believe me. So
Pretty
because
incredible.
we're talking 1971, so I was 10 years old, 9, 10 years old, somewhere in there.
Yeah,
It- it- you know,
that's some serious
but
stuff. You know,
a lot of it is, I don't know if it's because of the era we grew up in. We are 14 years apart, but we were both basically Cold War era kids. And
post. Oh no, you're
mm,
right. You're right. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm
but
thinking of World War
well,
II.
yeah, no, Cold War. You were, let's see, you were born in 75. Yeah, yeah, the Berlin Wall came down. You were 13, 14, something like that.
No, it's
15,
15, 16.
15. Okay, so yeah, we were both Cold War era kids. And I'm going to change topics here for
But
just a minute. Go ahead.
before you do, I was 15 or 16 because that was 91 or 89, 91,
That was 1990.
1990. So I was 15, and you were how old?
I was, oh my gosh, I was 29.
29.
Hmm.
Okay.
So, you remember seeing the movie Red Dawn? Wolverines.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you saw that movie, did you need any backstory?
No.
Did you understood the context of the movie?
Well, me specifically um, being that Cubans were infiltrating the United States, and we
Well,
are the descendants of the Cuban exile of the Castro of the communist thing.
well,
So
but I mean the context of the Russians invading
that's what
and
I'm trying to
using
tell you. That
nukes and things like that.
that's what I said.
Yeah.
That's the history that
Yeah.
we're attached to. We are
So
literally attached to that.
exactly. Well, I happened to, in my suggesteds up pop one, it was a young woman, 29, 28, something like that. I'm estimating. I don't really know how old she is. I don't think she's 30. She watched Red Dawn and immediately she was like, I don't understand. I didn't get any backstory. They never resolved the story. All this was a bunch of people doing this and that and the other. She liked the movie, but she wanted and prayed for more backstory. I don't understand why. I don't understand this. I don't understand that. And the only thing that kept popping into my mind was we lived the backstory. We lived during that time where that was a threat. That was in the back of a lot of people's minds. Nuclear arms races and this, that, and the other, duck and cover in school. That was a part of how we grew up. That was a part of our lives. We didn't need the backstory.
I gotta add one thing when you're done to this
So to
because it's
shift it up
pivotal.
to music, I wonder if that love of mid 70s to mid 80s is a product of that. We don't need the backstory for that music because we lived that.
Well, that is a good point, actually. We might need the backstory in the example that you're giving, even though we're living in concurrent with those people, kids now that are
Mhm.
listening to this crap music. Um, I'm gonna say it just like it is. But although we're living concurrently with them,
Mhm.
we might be missing the context of living through. Because even though we're living concurrently with these people, we're living a parallel universe at the same time. You and I
Yeah,
and all
yeah,
our
I
friends
agree. I
here,
agree with that.
yeah, you and I and all our friends here, for better or worse, stamp it with a rubber stamp right
Mhm.
now. You want to battle it out there. But we're living a parallel existence in these people because what they have floating around in the cesspool of floaty of
Not
their.
not a lot of happiness, is there?
But let me go back to one thing you said. So when you said that I need backstory and this and that and stuff, and I mentioned that no, because I do
Mhm.
want to expand on this. Unlike other Americans, although you can argue depending on which Americans,
Yeah.
but with immigration in terms of where my parents come from, it was ever so in the fore that at any moment the possibility. And a lot of people today will poo-poo it, but what they don't understand is that even after the Russians left Cuba,
Mhm.
the Russians were still in Cuba.
Yeah.
Um, and even though today people poo-poo it, the danger from Cuba and probably persists that we don't know, it persists. But
Mhm.
back then, was that not only did they have missiles which were taken away, but then they had biological endeavors
Well,
which could not be seen. And so, well, no, let me bow tie
I'm
this.
I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, go ahead.
I grew up, as opposed to the stories that others might have grown up in the United States from their parents and older,
Yeah.
adults.
Yeah, you were at ground zero.
I grew up listening to Ground Zero type stories from the
Mhm.
aspect of the Russians, the communism and the this and this and that. So even though I didn't experience it, right, but I had that backstory that was ever so present. So when this movie comes out, and all these guys are Cuban people attached with the whatnot people because they use I mean the whole story is there in Red Dawn. I'm thinking well, two things to wrap it up. One, I thought, oh, this will never happen here. This is a great story, but no way. But
Mhm.
if it does, you watch out. So that was what's on my mind back then watching
Mhm.
it. So I didn't think it was possible. But if you ask someone like my dad or
Yeah.
anybody in the Cuban community, because in reality they lost everything they had
Mhm.
to those same type of people.
It was a very real possibility.
Yeah, it wasn't even. It's not even. Well, let's ponder this in a philosophical. No, it was they took all their stuff.
Mhm. It
So
was see,
yeah,
this is what I'm talking about.
right. So I grew up as a um, derivative of that from an American perspective, but with
Mhm.
it's a weird place to
So,
be sitting.
and that's what I'm getting at is we can relate to that. You relate to it in different ways than I do, but we can both relate to it because we are a product of those times.
Yeah, American kids
Somebody,
were meant. American kids, just a thing. Americans, without saying it, American kids. We all knew as American kids. All of us knew as American kids.
mhm,
All of us that if the stuff hits the fan,
mhm,
little Joey is gonna. It doesn't matter if it's a slingshot. It doesn't
mhm,
matter if it's a couple of boats and stuff stuffed in a thing. It doesn't matter if
mhm,
this is. But we're gonna kick butt. We may drop
mhm.
individually, but we will not allow them to take over. So that was
That's it.
that was
Not without a fight.
yeah,
Not without a fight.
yeah.
But
That's what it was.
that's exactly what it was. It
We
was that
all
way
knew
to a
it.
lot of people, but we could relate to it. And you're right. People poo poo it now because they didn't live in those times.
Mm-hmm.
They can't relate to it. So, oh, that's a bunch of crap. All that. Man, you guys say that all the time. Yeah, we lived through it. I was that way talking to my grandparents about the Depression. That was in the 1920s. We lived through it. You didn't. I'm telling you.
But
Okay.
we're also a product. Look, even though we can't appreciate it like people that lived in depression, we're also a derivative of. Well, we're a derivative of all, but very specifically at the age of our grandparents, or level of our grandparents, for better or worse, we inherited things
Yes.
that we may not understand where they come from.
Yes.
Like, for instance, my behavior of being conservative with my expenditures, or that has
Yes.
to come from the freaking depression. And I don't even.
Exactly. Exactly. Living at or below your means.
Mhm.
Just because I can go out to McDonald's today and buy a Big Mac doesn't mean I'm going to do it. We're going to have a pork chops or something like that here at home because it's cheaper and I like it better. But that's beside the point. But
Yeah.
again, you're absolutely right. And that's where I was going to go for this. I didn't live through the Depression, so I couldn't relate to their stories, but I couldn't help but absorb their behavior because, especially when you're a child, you are an average of the five people that you hang the closest with. So you're getting input from your dad, you're getting input from your mom, in my case, my grandparents on both sides of the family. And I not adapted. I adopted some of that behavior without even knowing why. To this day, I hate waste. I do not like to waste anything. I really don't. And I spite every load of sawdust that comes out of my workshop because I know I could use that for something, by God, but not
let,
this week.
let me tell you this. I would collect the sawdust instead of tossing it
Mhm.
and put it in bags in case I needed it. That's how extreme. That's how extreme. Until one day I said, "Wait a
I want to show
second.
you something. I don't
I'm
do
not
this.
using the sawdust. Just, I mean,
You finally did throw it out?
I did.
Okay. Well, I it's funny this comes up. I'm waiting for a control to pop up. I got to zoom my camera out a little bit and show you something here. You can kind of see a little bit of it behind me. And then we need to think about landing the plane. Nope, wrong way. This way here. I'm in the middle of a project using epoxy resins where I'm making some little items for Linda. And
Nice.
I don't know if you can see it. And this is
Yeah.
epoxy resin. I got some scraps of wood in here, just little cutoff, little stuff that I found when I took the dust collector hose off of my table saw. That stuff fell out. And I broke it up and threw it in there and I poured epoxy resin in it.
Yep.
These two here are walnut shavings from when I ran some walnut through the planer. That one right there is maple shavings from when I ran some maple through the planer. I've got bags of planer shavings
That's hilarious.
in my shop that I'm using. And that there, when I cut some end grain cutting board, of that was the stuff that got stuck in the brush on my dust collector.
That's hilarious.
So I just cast it in resin, and I'm going to
How
make
about the
her.
green one?
Well, all these are just this is leftover resin I had from other projects. That's just leftover resin, and I dumped them in there.
The green one in the middle, number 9 or number 6?
That one,
Yeah, that one.
that one, and that one are identical. Those two are. Let me
No,
that
you see, no,
that one and that one.
that one, that one.
Yeah, those
Yeah,
two are identical. Number 3 and number 6 are identical.
number
Those are just
6.
pieces that I broke out of broke up that was stuff that was stuck in the dust collector hose. Number 3 has a yellow epoxy, a yellow translucent epoxy. Number 6 has a green translucent epoxy.
Well, number 6 reminds me of the Art Deco vibe of, yesteryears
Mm-hmm.
for some reason.
And we'll see what happens when I get them done. But this is how much I hate waste.
Are those coasters? Well, you don't have to
No,
tell.
they're going to be, without going into it too deeply, they are. It's a little flywheel on
Gotcha.
it's called a drop spindle, and you spin it and you spin fiber into yarn using a drop spindle.
Gotcha.
And there's that disc. It's about a 2.5-inch diameter disc that helps keep that spindle spinning. And people, here she comes with one. That's what they look like. You've got a hook up here, and you've got this shaft to keep it pointed downwards. You hook the fiber and you spin it, and this disc keeps it spinning.
That's gonna be trippy.
And
This is the first appearance. This is the
we'll be
first
using
appearance.
maple dowel for this. So
This was the first appearance off to the side
Mhm.
of Linda, and she just the hand handing
just
you
the arm. Yeah, she don't like to get on camera, so I mean, I can't. What can I say?
Well,
But
just
yeah, but that's just an example of how I hate waste. I don't like waste. I mean, I will try to find a way to use damn near anything.
yeah, and it could be problematic in some instances.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother, on my mother's side, used to tell me when I'd finish a meal, but I didn't finish the bread.
Mm-hmm.
She'd tell me to kiss the bread
Why?
and to be thankful of the bread.
Oh, okay. No, sweetie, no. She's standing in the doorway spinning wool with it. I'm like, okay, thank you. Jim, earrings. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of little things like that.
Or the ones that you open the hole and you put the piece in the earring,
Mm,
oh,
yeah.
in the ear. You know the
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That kind of went out quick, didn't it? I mean, it's still in some circles, but it's not as popular as it used to be.
it's
And
horrible.
believe, much like George Carlin, I'm all in favor of personal disfigurement. I figure that's one way of thinning out the gene pool. So,
But so yeah, my grandmother used to tell me kiss the bread,
mhm,
and thank God for the bread because we're gonna throw it out. It's bad to be wasteful.
mhm,
We don't throw out food. We have to be thankful of the food. So she'd tell me kiss the bread.
mhm,
It wasn't like a forced thing. She'd say, give it a little kiss and be thankful. Like as a kid,
mhm.
to teach me that this comes from, you know,
Yeah.
not the. It does come from the store, but there's also
Yeah.
something else to. So
Yes.
little things like that.
Yeah.
Where do those
And
things? I mean, that's a religious thing because
yeah, but I can see it. I
yeah,
can I can see it, and that's one of those little things. I mean, how many years later, 40 something years later, you remember it? That's part of your makeup, man.
if I see somebody kissing food and then tossing it, I know.
Yeah,
I think it's a Catholic thing.
because
In some,
but you can relate to it.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
other people might go, "What the hell's he doing?" Well, maybe he's just thankful that he had it, even if he didn't need it.
yeah. At least that
You know,
notion. It's good to say,
exactly.
yeah. All
You
right,
know, so yeah, we need to land the plane. We've been on over 2 hours, and this has turned into an after show.
all right, guys. So we go live every Tuesday at 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific Coast time here on the Trampled Underfoot podcast show. On YouTube, we have a Facebook page, Trampled Underfoot Podcast, on Facebook, and we usually post little knickknacks of things that we talk about every now and again over there. And we have a website called trampledunderfootpodcast.com where you could catch our past episodes by pressing the Wayback Machine button and downloading those to your podcatcher, computer, or whatnot, so you can enjoy on the go. We're also sponsored by.
Harneal Media, your web solution. People are finally starting to listen to me. I get reports here, and I'm glad to see it, and I'm glad to acknowledge it. If you're thinking about a web presence, if you're thinking about increasing your web presence, you need to hook up with my friend Steve over at Harneal Media. He runs a very tidy Keebler tree over there. You won't find better service. It's 100% personalized. When you deal with Harneal Media, you're dealing with Steve, not somebody you'll never talk to again in some call center somewhere. He's very competitively priced. He's very good at what he does, and you will be satisfied. That's Harneal Media, HARNEAL media.com, sponsor of trampledunderfootpodcast.com.
All right. Well, listen, guys, we hope you enjoyed this little stroll down different roads that took us, and well, we don't know if we got back. I don't think there's a way back, but we enjoyed the travel over the different little topics that we messed about with. So enjoy your week, be safe, and we'll catch you next time. Same bat channel. See ya.
Peace. Two piece.
Awkward wave.
Yeah, very awkward way.